Hey guys, welcome to the Speak Strength podcast. I'm your host, Jason Winley. I'm here with Mrs. Brett Brown. She is the Director of Education for SASS. And if you don't know what SASS is an acronym for Surviving Assault, Standing Strong. I'm going to start by saying it is somewhat of a self-defense class or course for ladies. However, I found it to be much more meaningful than merely a self-defense class. It's more of an empowerment for young ladies across the board, from whatever your background or to whatever your age. And she has worked hand in hand and side by side with those responsible for creating this particular course. And we're going to talk with her about her background and then some nuggets that she can drop on you guys. So we're looking forward to this conversation. Brett, is there anything that you'd like to say?
No, just thank you, Jason, for what you're doing and for giving me the opportunity to talk. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. All right, so first we're going to start off with the Director of Education for SASS. And I remember SASS starting, and the Director of Education wasn't necessarily a starting position that started with the program initially, but it's awesome to see how the program has grown to demand the need for a Director of Education. Can you tell us about your role and how SASS has grown to encompass the Director of Education as a position?
Absolutely. So, I've been involved with SASS on a variety of different levels for a number of years, really since it originally began. What happened over time, we worked really hard when you're teaching self-defense. Let's start there.
Okay.
And there's a group of women in the class. You really are holding their past, their present, and potentially their future in your hands. You are teaching them what it means to set boundaries and enforce them. You're talking about how valuable they are. You're looking at and acknowledging whatever happened in the past is not your fault. And whatever you did to survive was the right thing to do, and there's all these elements happening when you're in the room. And so as we kind of developed the program, pouring into it to address anybody who may be there, right? Anticipating those needs and putting something together that speaks to people's hearts and souls and lets them know how strong they are, that they're loved, and that they have a purpose that existed long before they ever met us, and is so much bigger than anything beyond this class, and giving them the confidence to embrace that and move forward. So once we kind of got the program together in full and we realized what we had, it was something that did not belong to us. It never had, in the sense that it was a living, breathing thing. And it wasn't because of us. It was the combination of women in the room. But when you realize you have this thing, it's not something that you can keep to yourself, right?
So this thing is like... This is constantly evolving, always over time. And the more people you introduce it to, and the more people you become introduced to. Okay.
Yes. And so it just starts to grow. And so the conversation really centered around, how do we give this to everybody? What does that look like? And not just in this area, because our mission as an organization is to eradicate assault, abuse, and trafficking globally. And so at the time when we actually formed the nonprofit, which was our vehicle for taking this information and getting it out there, there's three of us, right? Yeah. and we couldn't be everywhere. And so we knew what we needed were more instructors. So as far as my role as Director of Education, once kind of finalizing the curriculum for our general courses, writing that and developing that, my next job was to figure out, how do you teach other people to do this?
How do you teach other people to teach?
How do you teach other people to teach the curriculum that we had, so that we could train women who were like-minded and passionate about this information and help them embed it in their community and spread that way, from state to state. So my job was to write that training, everything that they needed to know, so that what they were teaching was not just the physical accuracy and all the important pieces there, but that it was trauma informed, not pretending to be counselors, but recognizing needs in the room. And that they, we look at it, that they're versatile, that they can speak to whoever's in front of them, that they can, really build this thing. And so my job was figuring out, how do we train them? And then two, establishing the standards, because what we're talking about really is life or death. And so watching that grow has been fascinating and exciting. A lot of work went into that. And, it's cool. We're in 15 states now.
Wonderful.
And that has been thrilling and humbling to be a part of the ride.
Oh, I imagine.
But to meet these women from literally coast to coast, from LA down to the Gulf and here, and bring them in, and they go through a 3-month training period before they can test out and certify. And it's been incredible. And to watch that wave kind of spread out state to state. So that's been a huge part of my role, is the curriculum of the courses, but also training other people to do it, to do it right, and to spread the good news.
So you mentioned the word standard, which means obviously when you're doing a curriculum and you're having to teach people to teach, you have to have some form of principles that underlie the baseline education. And you mentioned that. So I imagine it's very hard to take, or I guess when you're developing it and you have the idea of so many people's different traumas, you don't want to group them all in one. However, I'm imagining you guys found some similarities amongst everything that is going on in people's lives that allowed you guys to teach this so productively. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there's several different types of standards that our instructors are going through. But when it comes to looking at trauma, there are commonalities. You have to teach people where fear turns into trauma, and then how that plays out in different people's lives. So
where
obviously,
fear turns into trauma, is that what you said?
Yeah. Where fear turns into trauma and how it plays out in a survivor's life. And clearly everybody deals with trauma differently. Sorry, my computer did something weird. But it's what we call ripples in people's bucket. And I can explain it to you like this. When we talk about how trauma affects somebody's daily life in terms of commonalities, I always tell folks, if you imagine that a person is one of those 5-gallon buckets of water, like you see at Lowe's or Home Depot, right?
Yeah,
and it's filled to the top with water.
Okay.
Yep, one big bucket. An assault or abuse is like taking a fist-sized rock and chunking it in the bucket. And that rock sinks straight down to the bottom. So from the outside, you can't see that. But what you can see on the surface are ripples, right?
Yeah.
After it happens, everything splashes out, right? And it's a big old mess. But after that, there are these ripples on the surface, and they cover everything.
After the
and
initial,
they come in and they go.
After the initial,
yes, after the initial assault,
and the mess is huge in there. It's probably super visible to everybody immediately, right? It's hard, but then the ripples are what's happening as time goes on after the mess has died down. Okay.
Yes. And these ripples, they cover the entire surface. And so how that plays out in people's lives, ripples look different for everybody, but it affects their ability in terms of relationships and concentration and confidence. The difference between, I can also put it to you like this. There are lots of different kinds of trauma in the world, right?
Yes.
We see it in natural disasters, so tsunamis, earthquakes, things like that. The difference between a survivor of an earthquake and a survivor of interpersonal violence is the survivor of interpersonal violence is typically somewhat isolated. So think of it like this. A massive earthquake happens and there's survivors, people rush in, right? First responders, supporters, churches, all these people get involved to support whatever community was affected. So it's a shared experience. It's talked about.
Yes.
Resources are brought in. Typically with survivors, no one knows. And it's something that none of us we were never intended to carry that, right? It's something we were never intended to carry. But when no one knows, they've been walking along for a long time, seemingly by themselves. And processing that, a lot of times they tend to take responsibility on themselves. So in our classes, some of the first things that we can establish is, one, that they're not alone. That, two, nothing you do ever gives anybody the right to lay a hand on you, ever. And then three, that there is hope beyond this and beyond this moment, and working through that as a group, because, kind of like I said at the beginning, they are strong and they are loved and they have a purpose.
Yep.
And our classes are about digging in to that and training our instructors to recognize the specifics of how it plays out, and then how do you build somebody up from that moment. Because in our classes, we address some of this head on, and being prepared for that.
What you said, hope beyond this moment, which is one of the things I thought was really cool, is when I hear you guys talk about classes, I hear that this class isn't just pre-trauma, but it's also post-trauma. And so many people have learned to find their power after they've taken your class, that it's almost that the recovery process is enhanced by going through this. And can you talk a little bit about that? I know you've got some stories. Obviously, you can't tell everything, but give us a little insight of how that looks. That's an amazing. I love the way that I love the stories when I hear them.
Oh, so it's really look. I'm getting chill bumps right now just thinking about it. No, it's powerful, and we can look at this a couple of ways. So, a lot of people who have been dealing with past experiences, what happens, our body, in an effort to protect ourselves, recognizes kind of sensory things, sight, sound, smells that occurred right before the trauma. And when we see, feel, whatever those, our body goes, oh, you're in danger, and starts playing as if you are, right?
Yes.
And I think probably one of my favorite stories, we teach an elite course, which is an 8-week course that goes through everything from basic foundations all the way to defending against weapons. Anyways, there's this wonderful, beautiful woman in my class. She was in her 30s. She had 3 little girls. And I remember it's probably about our 4th week. I could see that something was going on with her, that she was having a hard time. And after class, she kind of lingered, and she came up to me and she said, Brett, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, every time at this time of year, when it turns fall, the leaves start changing color, I start feeling like I can't breathe and I can't sleep. And, my husband doesn't understand, and I don't know what's going on. And we started talking, and in her situation, it turned out that when she was a little girl, I think she was 4 or 5, her mom was murdered by a boyfriend in front of her. And it was that time of year.
Right.
And so her body, remembering the way that moment felt, was reliving that all the way into her 30s. And part of her taking this class was to figure out how to make things different. And along with counseling, let's be clear, we don't replace counseling. It's part of the therapeutic pie. But what was beautiful is I got to look her in the eyes and say, you're not crazy, right? And to talk through what was happening in her body, which gave her a handle. But more than that, I found out a couple weeks later, for years, she had nightmares about what happened to her mom.
Right.
And kind of that feeling of powerlessness. And she told me that one night, she said she sat straight up in bed because it started out as the same dream.
Right.
But this time she wasn't a child and she was an adult. And when she was an adult, she went and she fought back.
She won the day at the end of that.
She won. Yep. And she was telling me this, and she was crying because after that, she didn't have the dream again. And she told me, and it took all that I had not to boo-hoo, is she said, I get to rewrite my story because it doesn't have to end that way.
You were just talking about chill bumps, that rewriting the story right there, just chill bumps right there. She got to rewrite her story. And I have heard a version of that so many times over. Look, I've got it again. So many times over that, you can't stop, right? Like, we have to get this into everybody's hands because it's not us. It's not one person. It's not one class. It's that human beings are incredibly beautiful and resilient
when you give them the opportunity to support them and show them just how powerful they are.
Right. And so we're talking currently on trauma and how your class affects people post-trauma and that empowerment. But at the same time, you guys have gone from dealing with or working with people from about 14. I remember that was the age limit at one point in time. And you guys have opened a class for younger girls. That right there, I think, is amazing in teaching these girls empowerment. So how do you transition from such, I don't know a different word, but your approach is, I would call it, it's not aggressive, but the topics are different. They're hard. They're harsh topics, period. You can't get around it. Harsh topics from that older age group to being able to equip young ladies from the ages of about 6 to their teenagers age years.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We actually started with just 18 and up.
Okay.
And it didn't take long for us to realize it was too late and we needed to talk to them earlier, which is when the age range went from basically 9th grade and up. And we did that for a long time, but we were seeing the same things. You'd come in and it's crocodile tears and things that they'd been through. And we said, we have to back this up. And so what we did, as far as you asked about my role as director of education earlier, is we said, okay, well, let's go down to middle school. What does this look like? And obviously the curriculum, physically, middle school girls can do the same moves. Mentally, they're not in the same place.
Right.
So we had to write it in a way that met them where they were developmentally. So that's looking at both brain development and socially and all those things, because for middle schoolers, they're interested in new things. They get excited about that, but don't necessarily have the judgment to play out consequences and things like that. So kind of what does that look like? How do you hook them and gain their trust? And so we did that and it worked really, really well. We wrote the content for the talking portion specifically for the middle school girl.
Right.
And it was gorgeous. But we still found that for a lot of folks, it was too late and we needed to get there earlier. And some trends that we saw, along with a lack of confidence, which is a trademark of middle school, let's be honest, was that women and girls had a hard time saying no, feeling comfortable doing that, feeling like it was okay for them to do that, because, and also, understanding what healthy relationships and boundaries looked like. So then we decided we had to go to little girls. We had to start with little girls. And we pulled in experts. It wasn't just us, teachers, counselors, whatever, to write a curriculum that mom and daughter could take together. And what is so neat, that's our sassafras class. It's so unique. So little girls, it feels like play. They have a ball. When we get there, we talk to moms and caregivers first to explain why we're doing what we're doing so that they understand the intent behind it. And then we tell them, you're about to be her hero. So whatever I ask you to do, you do it full out, bigger and louder, and she's going to be so excited and you guys are in this together. Yeah. And so that's what we did. And we go in, and what's so beautiful, you walk in to a class with first graders.
Right.
And you look at those first graders and you tell them that they're amazing. And they're like, yeah, I am. Like, they're all in. They totally believe you. And it's what I always call it the bright eyes of before, right? Yeah. Like the world hasn't gotten to them yet. And so the goal with this sassafras class is that the bright eyes of before can be there forever. I think about this with my daughter all the time. And so it's to establish, one, the sassafras class is to teach them, yes, how important they are, but it's to prevent grooming. It's to look at, to teach kiddos how to recognize behaviors versus people. For so many years, they taught stranger danger. And that's just not enough, because over 80% of assaults are committed by somebody you know, trust, or love. So what you have to teach them is what healthy interactions look like, and that they have permission when they're uncomfortable to say, please don't do that. And then if it continues, what to do. And so, we don't get in the technicalities with the little girls, but they learn that they can stand their ground and that mama will be there and she will support them and she will encourage them. And there's this kind of foundation. It's teaching parents how to be a soft place to fall when mistakes are made, but also giving them the language to have conversations that don't scare these kiddos to death,
right.
but also that as they grow, can get more in depth when they have questions, when they have concerns. And so we provide a lot of resources too, but a lot of that is really building them up in here and what to do if for some reason they get separated from mom, or what to do if they feel uncomfortable, and just backing that up and giving them opportunity to learn the real thing. And I'll use this example, and I'm sorry if I am saying more right now than I need to, but
oh, you're good. You're good.
We always okay, thanks. We always teach moms that, at the Federal Reserve, when they're looking, the people who identify counterfeit bills,
okay,
they, when they're training for that job, they never study the fake ones at all. They only look at the real thing, and they look at it for years and years and years, studying every side, front and back, so that they know every detail, so that when a counterfeit bill passes through, they recognize it immediately because they've spent so much time with the real thing.
Yes.
What we try and do in our little girls class is to help those girls and their mamas and their family, whoever's in there with them, to give those girls the opportunity to interact with the real thing.
Yeah.
To see healthy relationships, to see love, to see support, so that whether it's at school or at soccer practice or wherever, when those girls encounter the counterfeit, they recognize it immediately and they know what to do.
Yeah.
And that's the goal, is to teach them the real thing, so that they can stand on that for years to come.
For years to come. One of the things I learned, obviously I didn't take a SASS course, but I've watched it come up for the last few years. But one of the things, because I have a daughter now, I didn't have a daughter when I first met Shannon and you guys. And one of the things I picked up, though, is what we do on a regular basis. And I've also had to tell, not that anybody was causing harm, but if we're playing or if we're tickling,
right,
or if we're wrestling, the word no and the word stop mean no and stop. I don't feel like doing it. And I thought that was something, it's small, but I think it's going to have a huge, I hope it has a huge impact. And from what we can tell, it does have a huge impact on her ability to be able to, even my son, it's not just stopping at my daughter, but no and stop, mean no and stop. And there's been times where I've heard them, whether it was with a family member and the family member was tickling them or just goofing off, and they said stop and no. And then it went from, oh, we're playing, to I said stop and no. And I've walked in just to oversee, just to make sure it's good. But I wanted them to, I want them to feel like they have the capacity to say stop and know that if they say stop and no, and they turn around, that daddy or mommy are there to agree and said, my son said stop. My daughter said stop. That means stop. I don't care if you're just playing. Please respect their physical being. That's what they're asking you to do. And that's one of the things I've really picked up from you guys, and I really appreciate the work. Even though I'm not in a class, there's still so much to be learned just from being in you guys' presence. It's amazing.
Thank you. No, and that's huge. Teaching people that their no should be respected. That's so big. So great job. And I'm excited to hear it. And you're right. It's not just little girls. It's girls and boys.
And so going a little bit away from that, you have grown up. I always want to try to find that element of faith where people are driven by their faith. And you grew up where your father was a pastor for many years. Yeah. And
yes.
So essentially you're a preacher's kid, and I am too, actually.
I am. Oh, okay. We recognize our own.
Yeah,
okay.
Real recognizes real. But so we're both preacher's kids, but we'll talk about your preacher story and your faith story. Tell us how faith has kind of intermingled its way into what you're able to do and what you've been able to do across your life right now.
I tell you what, it's almost impossible to know where to begin as far as how faith is intermingled with what I'm doing right now. There are about 4 million roads, right, that lead to this moment. And it's amazing how nothing is wasted. There are no scraps at God's table. I look back on my life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And let's face it, I'm a person. There's been some ugly.
We've all got those.
But he's used it, right? He's used it all. And I think the biggest thing, it's hard for me to pick and to be articulate in this, really, SASS Go, when I say it's its own living, breathing thing, most of what's happened is not something that we could have predicted or planned or pushed for. It's that the timing was perfect, and you watch all these things fall into place, and you look at the people involved and where they came from, myself included, and you see this beautiful story that is impossible to call coincidence, right? It's impossible. And I think what we witness in classes, I always go back to the fact there are several things. One, I always go back to the fact that we were created in God's image, right? And most people take that to mean the way that we look or our spirits, and that's certainly included. But, you talk about the word know and some of the things that we share. I go back to the fact if we're made in God's image, that includes his voice.
Right.
And I think about way back in Genesis, when he created the heavens and the earth, what did he do? He spoke.
He spoke.
Right?
He spoke the world into existence. That's right.
And that when we use our voices, knowing we're created in God's image, we can create whole new worlds for people simply by using our voice. And I see it happen over and over and over again. And I watch these people, in our classes, people are nervous, right? Nobody knows what to expect when you say we're going to fight, or, learn self-defense. But they come in nervous, and they're small and a little bit giggly, which is fine. But they leave big, right? They leave taller, having learned something about themselves that I didn't give them. I look at them and I think about the fact that God knows every single hair on their head, much less where their life is going. And so we get to come in and we get to speak truth, and we get to discover things about ourselves. They came in with everything they needed. We just acknowledged it.
Yep.
And then they see it and they walk out and they take that with them. And so when you talk about faith, we hear some really, really hard stories, but we also get to see truth and grace and hope. And if that isn't God moving around in every room, I don't know what is, and these perfect, beautiful people that he created, that he has a plan for. And it's just neat to have a moment with them that we can acknowledge how grateful they are that he put them here in this moment and is going to carry them forward. So that's how I view it, at least.
That's cool. That's really good. I think that's a good place to stop. But I think I'm going to go over some of the things you've said so far. You deal with people in their past, present, and their future, teaching them how to create boundaries. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we've gained out of here is boundaries are huge. And that's one of the things you guys teach both little girls. And then you almost repair those boundaries as those young girls become older, or if they've gone through trauma, it's where did the boundaries get set up again? What's the next set of boundaries look like? And you guys are kind of like a landing pad for those girls. And I think that's an amazing place. Obviously, we said before, you're not taking the place of a clinical or a clinician or a counselor.
Right.
But you're part of the process. And I think that's what's a huge thing. And the fact that it's backed by faith. And I think that's one of the biggest parts, especially since you guys are dealing with sometimes it's just harsh. And you have to have something to rely on. Something strong to hold your foundation in. So if there's anything you'd like to conclude with, Brett, I really appreciate your time.
Oh, no, I'm so grateful for you. I think the only thing that I would conclude with is that if anybody listens to this and is interested, to head over to our website. There's so many ways to get involved, and it's sasco.org. That, we always say we'll keep building a bigger table if you're willing to join us, because this is not something that can be done alone. And so I would invite anybody, if it speaks to your heart in any way, to reach out, and let's find a way to plug in, because it's going to take all of us to do this thing. But Jason, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm glad we could have this conversation. We thank you guys for watching and listening out there to the Speak Strength podcast. We hope you guys have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.